Hello there. Thank you for tuning in to Under the Dome on Town Meeting TV. My name's Bobby Lucier. On this program, we're a couple months past the end of the legislative session this year, and we are joined by the leadership in the legislature, the Speaker of the House, Jill Krowinski, as well as the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Phil Baruth, to talk about what was accomplished this session. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So let's start. Well, we'll dive into what this session looked like in a moment. Let's first start with the flooding that hit the state a few weeks ago, and obviously folks are still digging out. I went down to Plainfield a couple of weeks ago, and it's really disturbing. I'm sure you all have been around the state as well, but can you speak a little bit to just what you're hearing from communities around the state as they're recovering from flooding, and what the need is right now? And Jill, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, my heart goes out to everyone who's been impacted by the recent flooding, and it's been extra traumatizing for those who just went through this last year, almost, just finishing their repairs on their house, and to have this happen again is just, it's awful. And so as I've been going out across the state and meeting with members of the legislature and their communities, we're hearing that the damage, especially with roads, class 4 roads, has been really, really bad. I was just talking to a member yesterday who lost his driveway in the storm. And so it's really tough out there. But once again, our communities are coming together to make sure that the impacted families have access to temporary housing, to food, to the care that they need to get through this. And it's heartbreaking when you see so many GoFundMes up to support families who are impacted. So I think that's a place where we need to continue to talk about what we can do to help families who are in crisis from flooding. A GoFundMe is not how we should be supporting these families. And I know that we have limited state resources, but I think relying on just volunteers and communities for helping families through the long run, we need to do more when it comes to that. And so we're listening and making sure that all the needs, if someone needs access to a certain type of truck, or we're kind of connecting people. I feel like, I was just telling someone the other day, I feel like our office is like the 211 for legislators to say, like, I have a constituent who needs this, where do we go? And so we're making lots of connections. And so sadly, this is our new norm, and that's why our work on climate resiliency and infrastructure is so important.
Yeah, thanks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are you doing?
I just want to add in, we were talking before we went on camera about the especially traumatizing nature of having it happen on the same day. Frustrating for those of us in the legislature 2 years in a row, because right after we get out of session, we in a sense lose our powers when we go out of session, and the governor becomes the emergency response figure, and the administration. So the administration has so far done good work. They've got 4 recovery centers set up: Barry, Lindenville, Plainfield, Heinsberg, and those are going to be open on a rotating basis. I think that's all to the good, but everything is going to hinge really on a FEMA declaration, a federal disaster declaration, and that's supposed to come today or tomorrow, I think. So
what needs to happen in order for that to be in place?
Well, one thing was people needed to report their damage over the 211 line so that we could pass that on to the federal government and make a case. That's been happening, that's been ongoing. Hopefully that won't stop, because as we saw with last year's flooding, you sometimes have follow-on flooding, and maybe you can get help with that as well. So, hopefully people continue to get the federal help, which is mostly for municipalities and infrastructure, some for individuals, but as we saw last year, individual businesses kind of fall through the cracks. They can get low interest loans, but tough beyond that. So last year we stepped in with what we called BGAP grants, business grants, and I imagine we'll be doing something like that this time around.
And that's state funding?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And what is so we have not received any FEMA funding from this round of flooding?
I don't
year?
believe so.
I don't
not
think
yet.
so, not yet.
Not until the disaster is declared.
Just to give you a sense of the relationship with FEMA, it's a very long-term relationship. I believe we got our last check from FEMA for Hurricane Irene the day before the floods last year. So that was a very long time ago, and so it's a very long process going back and forth with the federal government to make sure that we get all the support we need. But it's going to be a long road.
Right. Well, thank you both for your close attention to that issue and those folks who are really struggling right now. It's scary. It really is. And maybe just on that note, thinking about climate resilience, the next flood coming down the pike, how is the legislature thinking about flooding resilience, climate resilience, and making sure that we're more prepared for future disasters?
I'll pick up on that. When we went back into session, Jill and I both spoke with our respective bodies and made clear that flooding was number one issue, short, medium, and long term. So how are we going to be better prepared next time out? And at the furthest remove, how are we going to reduce our carbon output so that we're not contributing in the long run to greater warming? So I give my Natural Resources Committee great credit. They produced what came to be called the Flood Safety Act. And the Flood Safety Act is looking at all the areas that, if you remember during the flooding last year, everybody had their eye on dams, especially the dam outside Montpelier. And so that bill puts people in position to analyze dams, to look at dams, to be making sure that the dams are strong enough to bear the load we're going to ask of them. Then beyond that, it looks at river corridors, wetlands, floodplains, and puts resources and employees in place to map those areas, to make sure we're not building in places that are threatened, but also to help strengthen communities, downtowns in particular, in the face of this persistent flooding. So I think that particular act put in place 16 new employees. That's a significant investment over time. So where should that money come from? We also, House and Senate, passed what was called the Make Big Oil Pay bill. And the idea is that the big oil companies understood the long-term effects of their product. There are allegations that they hid that from consumers and from regulators. And so it asks for significant restitution over a 10-year period, along the lines of $100 million a year. So that may well land us in court, but if it does, we will be fighting the good fight, because our taxpayers should not be paying for damage caused elsewhere.
Yeah, some other investments that we made, we created a program to help raise houses who've experienced floodings. I know that was really important to some communities who don't have a lot of other places to grow their housing stock, right? And so programs like that. We're looking at other ideas around flood insurance. As you know, it's extremely expensive and really hard for people to have access to. So we're doing some work around that. And then in the long term, we also passed the Renewable Energy Standard, and that sets goals to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and increase access to renewable energy sources. As you know, we can't control gas prices, but with renewable energy we can. And so that is a long-term strategy that we have. And then in addition to that, our Act 250 modernization bill also is a longer-term, where do we grow our communities, and how do we do it in a way that respects the environment? And so those were some of the other strategies that we used for the long term in thinking about resiliency and infrastructure.
Can you speak a little bit to how that Renewable Energy Standard bill works? I know that it's a big part of the decarbonization effort in Vermont, and also there's some concern about where the cost lands in terms of who's actually bearing the cost of the transition. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, our main goal is to ensure that we're helping low and middle income families have access to clean, renewable energy sources. And we want our gas companies and our energy companies out there to reduce their reliance on fossil fuel and increase access to reliance on renewable energy. So across the state, we've set goals to meet that, and now we're in the implementation process for it. So it's setting goals and ensuring that we have the resources to help people transition off of fossil fuels.
Right, and I would just add that the renewable energy standard that we just passed builds on previous work in that area, the first renewable energy standard. This one has a more tangible goal of 2035, I believe. And, you know, I think you can't talk about flooding and divorce it from that. And without putting too fine a point on it, I just want to point out that in general, the governor and his party have opposed us at every step of the way in terms of something like the Renewable Energy Standard or the Affordable Heat Act, which we passed last year. Those are absolutely must-pass bills if we're ever going to transition off of fossil fuels. But every time we come out with a bill, and as Jill said, those bills are always designed to protect people at the lower end of the economic scale. They're very carefully designed. But there's a lot of scaremongering that goes on because there are costs and there are disruptions if you transition from one fuel source to another. So, you know, we always do it with an eye toward making sure that people are not, you know, economically harmed. But with that said, we always face a veto reliably and opposition post-veto from the GOP. And so what we've been able to do, we've kind of had to carry over the finish line ourselves.
And I just want to mention, you know, talking about the pushback from the Republican Party, I was shocked to see that this super PAC, Republican PAC, Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, have been dumping tons of money into Vermont with these postcards with misinformation about what the bill does. And so I think it's just important for us to name it, that there is this effort of out-of-state big corporation money coming in to spread misinformation about the bill, and that's really frustrating, and you know, something that we can't control, right? But I'm shocked to see like 5 or 6 different postcards some people have been receiving with blatant lies on them, and that's not the way we do things here in Vermont. And I hope that the governor and others will stand up and say this is not okay and tell them to stop, because it's hurting people, it's hurting families, and thinking that something's going to happen that's not.
I wanted us to stay out of the weeds to start, but we got
Sorry,
right into
we
it,
did.
and that's fine. I think I just want to, before we move on from that point, I think I struggled to explain how the Affordable Heat Standard and Renewable Energy Standard actually work economically. You know, I mean, you mentioned that there are goals in these bills. Are there penalties that then do they get assessed on fuel dealers? Like, what is the actual what are the financial mechanisms at play here that are guiding the transition?
Well, there is, in the Affordable Heat Act, there is, you know, I would call it an encouraged partnership between the fuel dealers and the state. So we are saying you need to acquire credits, and you get credits by offering renewable energy sources in addition to your traditional fossil fuel sources. So, you know, back to the speaker's point, the fuel dealers didn't want to be part of this diversification of their interests. Some did, you know, and some electricity companies, for instance, were very excited about it. But there were a lot of fuel dealers who wanted to stay with their traditional plan of offering only heating oil or offering only, say, natural gas, rather than offering other renewable forms. So there is a stick there for those companies. And it takes place through this credit system, but then there's a penalty if they don't acquire enough of those credits.
And that's the Affordable Heat Act. And
That
so
is
then
the
the renewable energy standard, does that work similarly? I don't know if Speaker, you want to?
Well, that is going to be in the works with rules that need to
Okay.
be set. And so I think it's really important for people to follow the process as it goes through, and there'll be other opportunities for people to come and give their feedback and opinions as they write the rules out for how it's implemented.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've touched on climate. Let's zoom out and talk about the session as a whole. Could maybe, if Speaker Krowinski, if you want to just start with sort of a big picture recap, what was accomplished this session, and then we can kind of touch on a few of the things that have been most, that have been most pressing. But let's start big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I always start off, we are on a mission to create an economy that works for everyone in Vermont and leaves no one behind. And that's all 14 counties. That's critical to our work to ensure that we're helping everyone along. We're leaving no one behind. And this session was really hard. We had some really tough things we had to work on. We talked about the flooding, and we talked about our work around climate change. We also made housing a top priority and invested money in affordable housing, more importantly, a permanently affordable housing for people. And in addition to that, we did some really great work around healthcare. As you know, we're a little state, and we can't have a huge reform around how we can change the system. We need help from Washington, D.C. for that. But there are steps that we can do to make healthcare more affordable and accessible to people. So one example of that is a bill around prior authorization. So healthcare providers have to get permission from insurance companies for certain tests, screens, and pharmacy. And so what this bill did was eliminated the paperwork, the barriers around prior authorization, so that doctors can do their jobs and focus on their patients and spend less time with paperwork. So that's an example of what we did. We also invested in a Medicare Part B program to give older Vermonters access to money back for what they're paying in. And so there'll be some folks that see money coming back to them. I think for an individual, it's around $2,000. That goes into effect next year. That's also another way we try to help alleviate some of the pressure when it comes to healthcare. And then obviously we had a long, tough debate about public education and how we fund it, and that is an ongoing effort that I'm sure we'll dive more into, but that was a really big conversation at the State House this year.
So I would just, flooding obviously rose to the top the second year, but if I look at the biennium as a whole, one of the things that strikes me is that we were able to do things that had been previously impossible. Things that people had tried for 10 years, 15 years to do and couldn't get anywhere. And I'll name two. One was childcare the first year. So, when I was a new parent, I was amazed at how expensive it was to put my first child in childcare. It was more than my mortgage at that point. And my second child came along 5 years later, but if they had come back to back, I don't know what we would have done, my wife and I. As it was, we barely made it work. But the problem is not only how expensive childcare has been, but there haven't been enough slots because the individual childcare centers can't make the business model work. And so we, building on work that had been done over a 2 or 3 year period and legislation that had been drafted, we managed to pass a historic childcare bill, $125 million investment every year in childcare. And that does a couple of things. It brings the price down for parents. It makes centers able to open up in places where they didn't previously exist, more slots for parents to choose from. But then the other thing is if you work in one of those centers, you will be paid a going wage. And so people won't have to choose between the vocation they love and a decent paycheck. So that's all to the good. The last thing it does is it supercharges the workforce, because if you have a parent that wants to return to the workforce, they can find childcare for their kid. The other thing I wanted to mention was the Act 250 modernization bill. I don't know how many times we talked about a grand bargain. It would get 3/4 of the way there, and then one wheel would fall off and it would collapse. And what the intention was always was to balance environmental interests on the one hand with rapid development where we want it, that is in village centers and downtowns, to alleviate the housing crisis. So this time, amazingly enough, we were able to get those sides to agree, the Chamber of Commerce on one hand, Vermont conservation voters, and all of these environmental groups, all of these pro-development groups, all of the way they were with us. And we managed House and Senate to get that over the finish line. And then inexplicably, because it's been his number one goal, Phil Scott vetoed that bill. And he came to us with a little list of about 9 things he wanted, none of which seemed like a deal breaker, but at that point we had the strength, we had the momentum, and we wanted a bill that created balance, not overly balanced on the housing side. So we were able to override, and to my mind that's like catching a unicorn. People had been trying for forever. That's the voters' gift to us, was enough votes to be able to do things like that when we absolutely needed to.
So on that bill, I know there are rules that still need to be written around this Act 250 reform bill, but do we have a sense of how this will impact housing in Chittenden County specifically? Do you want to talk about
Sure.
that?
So it's built on the idea of deduplication. So let's say you're wanting to build in Burlington or somewhere, Winooski, somewhere where there's robust zoning and infrastructure, sewer, all of that stuff. There are also, entities that are in place who are scrutinizing environmental impacts. So do you need Act 250 on top of that? And the way the process works is you get all of your other permits and then you get your Act 250 permit. It lengthens the time that you need to bring your project online, and it increases costs. So the grand bargain was we deduplicated in areas that had zoning, sewer, infrastructure, et cetera, where we want rapid housing development to ease the housing crisis and the rental crisis. And in return for that, the bill contains things like the road rule. The road rule says that if you go more than, I believe it's 850 feet off the road into the forest, you then trigger Act 250 in more sensitive parts of the state. So it's balancing a little more scrutiny in environmentally sensitive areas with less scrutiny and less regulation in areas where we need that housing fast.
Anything to add on this, Speaker Krowinski?
I just have to reiterate that it is so rare to have a group of people like this come together to find a compromise, really show up at the table and say, like, we're going to stay here and we're going to figure it out. We've been working on this effort to modernize Act 250 for years. And so I just have to give a shout out for all of those that were involved that stuck together to make sure that we got this across the finish line. It's time, it's needed to happen. And so it was just a really great effort all around.
So there's the regulatory side of promoting housing in the state. There's also, the state has made some pretty big investments in the past few years to build housing. Could you speak a little bit to where and when we're seeing some of the investments, and I know it takes a long time to build, especially now, but where we're seeing some of these new investments from the state in affordable housing pop up, and how they might be, are any of them actually going to be available to people that are currently experiencing houselessness in Burlington? What's the update
Sure,
there?
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll give you one example. Just a couple weeks ago, I was at a groundbreaking in Shelburne, right on the edge of Shelburne in South Burlington, where they're taking an old hotel, they're tearing it down, and they're building units to go up. There will be apartments and there will be condos. And the goal is that to have access for low-income families to come in and start to build some credit and be able to save some money so that they can then buy a condo. This is a project with lots of partners, VHCB, VHFA and the state also contributed money to make sure this project could happen. And that is a model that we are seeing across the state. But you're seeing projects like that happen in many different places in Chittenden County. But this new one, you can see it right now in the works on Shelburne Road being built, which is super exciting.
So in the House this year, there was a bill, H.829, I think, right, which moved forward some really significant investment. I mean, there has already been significant, but $100 million a year for 9 or 10 years. Is that, I don't know if that's quite accurate, but in building affordable housing around the state. And that was passed in the House, but then it seemed like that level of spending didn't quite make it through the Senate. So can you talk a little bit, maybe Jill, if you want to talk about that bill, and the intention, and then Phil, maybe you can talk about where it went in the Senate.
Sure, yeah. So obviously, any place we go and whoever we talk to, housing comes up every single time, right? When I was just in Bennington the other day, and they were talking about wanting to be able to hire some more staff, but the staff couldn't find housing, and they lost. So we just know every time it comes down to housing, and the administration doesn't have a long-term vision for how we can meet housing goals. We wanted something that was just strategic and thoughtful, that said this is where we want to go with housing in our state to make sure that we have enough for low and middle income Vermonters, and we have to have the investment to back it up, and that investment was a wealth tax, having the most wealthy pay their fair share. And it was a bold bill. I think, again, with the absence of leadership from the administration, we really wanted to set something out there for people to talk about and for us to have a conversation about what is our long-term vision for housing in our state. So that is the high level of what we passed, and then it headed over to the Senate.
So before I go there, I just want to point out that if people want to go to VHCB's website, Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and you click on news, you will see a flood of announcements of projects that are opening around the state, or breaking ground rather. So, Heinsberg, Rutland, Highgate, and then Chittenden County, you've got plenty going on. So there are hundreds, if not thousands of units that are going to come online in the next couple of years because of the investments we made during and post-pandemic. And then this past year, we decided the regulatory piece was the key to what we needed now. But to your question, so I'll just say that the House and the Senate are on one page about the need for significant housing investment, and also strategic thought about regulation, among other things. How can we partner with different groups, the state that is, to get these things done? VHCB has been a great partner, Champlain Housing Trust, et cetera. But where we differed, I would say, was just on the timing. So we knew in December that there was going to be a big spike in property taxes, and big doesn't really do it justice. What we heard in December was 18%, 20%. It was a frightening prospect. And so the Speaker, my office, we got to work right away on trying to bring that number down. But we knew at the end of the day there was going to be a big property tax year. The other thing I would mention is that childcare, which again was a great achievement and will help our state immeasurably, but that is connected to a payroll tax to pay for it. That was coming online this month, July. So those two things together led us to believe that it wasn't the year to do it. But a shout out to the Ways and Means Committee, which did a lot of great work on this. It's not something we've thrown away. We're always looking at what can we pick up when, and so I would imagine we will be back to the drawing board on that next year.
And can you speak a little bit to I think there's a lot of conversation about increasing taxes and the fear that wealthy folks might leave the state. Is that a real fear in the Senate that you're hearing, and how real do you think that is?
I don't think it's a systemic thing. So, evidence shows that waves of people don't leave the state. I do know that individuals leave the state, but we have a lot of people who are moving into our state for all kinds of reasons. One of the reasons being that we take care of our people. And so I think the investments we made in childcare, for instance, will more than balance that out. With that said, people at the higher end of the economic scale are people. They are families. They are people struggling to get by in their own way, not with the same basic challenges that somebody at the lowest end of the economic scale would have. But I think it's fair to say that there's a certain taxing capacity every year, and maybe the chambers view it a little differently, but we're always trying to balance what we're doing in terms of creating affordability here with the expense it might cost somewhere else.
Let's also, while we're talking about housing, talk about the folks that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in Vermont. This number has gone up. I think it was around 1,000 prior to the pandemic, and now it's about 3,000 people. And there was a conversation. I mean, there was pandemic-related funding to support housing some of those folks, and now that's gone away. Can you talk a little bit about the conversations around supporting those folks and what was landed on in the legislature as far as supporting shelter for those folks?
Absolutely. So, when the pandemic hit and we made sure everyone had housing, that was the right decision. It was the right decision at the time to make sure that everyone had a roof over their head and that they were safe. But it's not a sustainable way or fair way to house people who are unhoused. And so we've been having a conversation over the last couple years of how do we transition housing away from hotels and into housing that better supports people. And so we've been slowly closing down the hotel program and looking at ways that we can better sort of, again, modernize our general assistance program so that it's a program that's more sustainable and helps people better. And so we've invested a lot of money this year, I think around $50 million, into a solution of transitioning away from hotels and looking at what kind of housing that we can put out there to help that's more affordable but also helps people. So what I talked about, like the housing that we saw that's being built in Shelburne, right? Those apartments are going to be available, and there's going to be services that are available to people to make sure that they have access to a job, health care, et cetera. We know that that's really important. So we have a group of legislators and stakeholders and advocates meeting over the summer and fall to talk about what that looks like more, so that when we come back in January, we can say, okay, we've gotten to this point. We're slowly out of this transition. Now let's talk about what we want it to look like and how we fund it. And so it's an ongoing conversation, but it is something that we have spent a lot of time and money on trying to solve, because living in a hotel room is not fair. It's not ideal, and it needs to be a better way.
And just to build on that, I mentioned that if you go to VHCB's website, you'll see all of these announcements about projects that are moving forward. $7 million to this project, $8 million to this. All that state money is passing through the Housing and Conservation Board's hands. And one of the things that they've done that I think is really wise, really smart, is they've tended to create a model in most of these projects where there are a mix of 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments, 3-bedroom apartments, mixed income, but then there's also reserved in almost all of these projects a certain number of units for people experiencing homelessness. So as those projects come online, it's building our capacity to house people, as Jill says, in places other than motels. The other thing that I would say is as Jill said, we can't spend the kind of money that the federal government gave us during the pandemic. But what we have done over the last 3 or 4 years is we have greatly expanded eligibility for the motel program and for shelter for folks. And we've expanded the range of dates that these are open. So they open earlier in the year and they close later in the year. So it isn't 100% coverage for every person every day of the year, but what we've done is to broaden out that coverage to make it more humane, make it more sustainable, and as these other units come online, hopefully we can transfer people to those.
Right. So there are solutions in the work. There's tremendous need just in terms of managing expectations for, say, the coming winter, do you expect that there will be more or fewer people living without shelter in the state this winter than last winter, for example? Or is that something?
I don't know. I think that's a really tough question to answer. Obviously, we hope that it's lower and that the housing that's getting built and the shelters that are being built are expanding access and that there are more options available. But again, that's why this effort in Montpelier is so important, and ensuring that we have enough shelter beds and ensuring that we do have transitional housing available for people, and it's a step-by-step path for them. So I hope it's going down, and we'll be closely monitoring it to make sure we're doing what we can to help people.
And just to add in, this is not just going on in Vermont. This is a nationwide phenomenon, and it's important to realize that because these are macro forces at work. If you think about the inflation that the whole world has been experiencing for the last couple of years, all of that is part of why you're seeing rents go up and housing prices go up. That's exacerbating the problem. Not to mention the opioid epidemic, which we'll get there maybe in a little bit, but we were able to override the governor and create an overdose prevention site in Burlington, which I believe is the next step toward trying to accelerate the end of the opioid epidemic.
While we're on that, what's the process and timeline on that? So when can we expect that to be up and running, and how do we determine as a city or as a state where that actually ends up?
So what the bill says is that there's a pilot site in Burlington, but it'll be the city council and the mayor who will cite that. And I think that's as it should be. The new mayor, Emma Mulvaney-Stanek, has said a year she expects it to be up and running, and I think that's a realistic goal. If people aren't familiar with these sites, yes, they allow people to consume the drug that they would be consuming otherwise in a public park or behind a building or in an alley in a safe environment. While you have those people there, you can connect them to wraparound services. That's why I believe it's part of the solution. It's part of ending the problem, not, as some people fear, an indefinite expansion of the problem.
Before we move off housing, the Burlington voters passed a just cause eviction ballot question a few years ago and sent it to the legislature. When a ballot question gets passed, a charter change in a city gets passed, it then has to pass the legislature. It hasn't passed the legislature. Can you kind of remind us where we're at with that charter change?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. Unfortunately, we did get it to the governor a couple years ago. Gosh, that feels like a decade. And we did not have the votes to override it. And so we've been working to see if there are other solutions. There have been conversations about, is this something that we should just do statewide, because several different municipalities now have passed similar requests for charter changes to have just cause. And so during last session, we started to have a little bit of a conversation about what would it look like statewide, or is there some sort of, we've done this for other charters that have happened in multiple different towns, where we say, well, this is what the formula should look like, or this is the template for it, so that there's some consistency across different municipalities. So it's going to be an ongoing conversation. I know it'll come back up in January for sure. And we'll see whether those who are elected come back, if there's support to go the route through charters, or if we want to do something that's more statewide.
So this session, was there not support in the House to pass the Burlington charter change?
I don't believe there was.
Okay. And yeah, okay. Maybe we'll move on now to education and property taxes. So property taxes are on many folks' minds. They're coming in the mail right now. What's on the table as far as, so there was a commission that was passed, and maybe if one of you wants to just talk about the commission that was passed to kind of look at future education structure or funding structure for education in the state, and what that commission actually looks like and who serves on it, and what their timeline is. Do you want to talk about that, Speaker?
Sure. Well, I think it's important just to take a step back as to how we got here to this commission. So this year, school budgets were coming in higher than anticipated because of certain costs. So the cost of healthcare, we're all feeling that went up a large amount. Schools had used up the COVID money that they got through the pandemic. The cost of providing certain services for kids has gone up. There's more need, more than ever. And so what we started to see are school budget increases that we did not anticipate. We knew that they were going to be coming in higher, but not that amount. And so it's the voters that decide what they want to fund for their schools, and then it comes to the legislature, and then we figure out the mechanism of how much we're going to pay for it, right? And so this year it was extremely difficult, and we worked really hard to find the balance of lowering the amount of the tax rate while also trying to come up with some long-term solutions, right? We want our kids to have the best public education system possible, and we also want it to be affordable for families. And that was what we wrestled with. And so we did come up with some revenue sources to help lower it. We used some one-time money. And then we said, okay, we're not going to be able to really come up with the long-term solution for this in 2 months, but we can work together with the commission to start figuring out what can we do to help support our public education system while finding ways to lower cost. And so this commission has members of the legislature on it, members from the administration, also members from the superintendents, principals, school boards, associations, and they had their first meeting a couple weeks ago, and they're now going to start diving in.
Are either of you on the commission?
No.
No.
But we each appointed people to it. One of the interesting things about it is it has a steering group that is a sort of commission within the commission, and the steering group develops the agenda for the larger group, but they're also tasked with looking more specifically at funding and financing. So it's my hope that they will come back with viable suggestions for ways to save money. I just want to make sure that people understand. I was talking to a guy on the phone, and he was a wonderful guy. He was upset about his property tax bill, and he kept referring to it as the spending that you guys are doing under the Golden Dome. And I don't think people understand that their votes on their local school budgets, that determines how much we spend on education.
Right.
So it's not as though you vote on your local budget and then it gets sent to Montpelier and we decide, well, we want to spend 50% more than that. We never spend more than the local communities spend. What we do, if anything, is we bring the bill down because we think it's too high. So in this case, we brought the bill down by 1/3. So instead of 18 or 19%, it's 13.8. That took months of work to get it down to that level. But with that said, I understand people are at their wits' end about their personal economy. So people should just know it's not that we stopped our work when we adjourned. The work continues. Mm-hmm. Every month we have people, you have Peter Conlon, we have Ann Cummings from our body working on this, and all of that information, all of that skull sweat will get fed right into a bill in January, and hopefully we'll have ways that we can reduce the possibility of spikes, but also just in general, bring the cost down and the quality up.
Yeah. There are a few different options that have been floated around here. What are the options that you kind of see as potentially viable on the table, or that you're just starting to think about?
Well, there are some. We've been having conversations for years about what is the right amount of schools for our state. How many supervisory unions should we have? How many Do we have one principal for one school? Do we have what? So I think there's different models that the commission will be looking at. And I know that, we've talked about consolidation. We've talked about classroom size. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that. And then on the finance side, our goal was to say, what should we be doing to make sure that we're doing right by our kids? And then how do we pay for that, right? So there's almost two conversations happening about, for example, classroom size, how many teachers? And then we're going to also be talking about, okay, so we pay for our taxes this way. Is this the right way to be paying for it? Should we be tweaking it further? What does that look like? So there are two conversations happening at the same time. And what I've said numerous times is, everything's on the table. We are at a very critical point, and we can't go in saying, okay, well, we're not going to talk about this, or we're not going to talk about this. It needs to all be on the table, these different policy ideas. It's time.
And I agree fully. And one of the things that needs to be on the table, we have always been a state that prioritizes local control. And I believe in local control for curriculum, budgeting, et cetera. I think we do a great job in general with our small districts and our small schools. But what I will say is, if you don't have any authority over the individual groups that are creating the spending, creating the bill, then that authority doesn't exist in the case like this past year. So I've been looking at something called an allowable growth percentage. I know the Ways and Means Committee kicked it around. We in the Senate looked at it in the Finance Committee. And what it would basically do is create a level of budgeting authority over the local districts. There are different ways to think about it, but that's the basic idea. In the same way that we've tried to have the Green Mountain Care Board act as a brake on hospital spending, we would have a board that would have authority to require that districts that want to spend more than that allowable growth percentage justify that spending, and if it falls into certain disallowed categories, they might be forced to cut their budget before they bring it to voters.
And one other policy that we're working on is around school construction. We know that deferred maintenance is so expensive, so very expensive. The state used to help cover some of those expenses, and we stopped, and we have now started the conversation back up to say, okay, what can the state do to help school districts with construction? And that is another important piece of this conversation, because that could help alleviate some pressure, not all of it, but that's another place where it could help.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to public safety and criminal justice here. Another issue that's been, I think, on folks' mind quite a bit. What was done this session on criminal justice, and how do you expect it to impact what's happening in downtown Burlington?
I'll start. So going back 3 years ago, I started to hear from merchants on Church Street, and I heard at a volume I hadn't been used to. So they were really having a hard time. I don't want to name the particular businesses, but they are large businesses, and they were seeing lots of their product walk out the door. Retail theft was a real issue. So we tried 2 years ago to come up with a solution. Couldn't quite get it done. But this past year, House and Senate worked together, and in the conference committee where we reconcile our differences, we came up with an addition to the laws around retail theft. So it used to be that under $900, there wasn't much in the way of penalty. And many people thought that that allowed people to, essentially steal up to that limit without too much in the way of consequence. So what we did was to create for theft over $250, but under $900, we created a series of penalties based on the first time you do it, the second time you do it, and the third time you do it. And the thinking was that there are a relatively small group of people in all of the downtowns that many people in law enforcement believe are behind most of the retail theft. And so what this said was, if this is your second offense, the penalty is greater. By your third offense, you can get prison time. So we spent a lot of time talking and analyzing and making sure that we weren't going to inordinately increase detention or incarceration, but we did want there to be a series of penalties with teeth for people who were making a small career of stealing from downtown merchants.
And then another investment that we made was in our court system and staffing for it. So before the pandemic, we had a backlog of cases in court, and then the pandemic happened, and it made it just so much worse, just like with so many other challenges that we have. And so we made investments in the budget to hire and create more staff and judges to help with the problem, because I remember debating this bill on the floor and someone saying, well, it's only 800 cases, and then someone saying, no, it's 1,600 cases, and it was the numbers kept on going up, and that puts a lot of pressure on our court system. And so we know that just by making this investment, we can start working down on that backlog, which I do think it'll help.
And I mentioned the Overdose Prevention Center bill earlier in the show. I would add that in here, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, again, if people are going to consume these drugs, xylazine or fentanyl or heroin, these are horrific drugs with horrific effects, but one of the effects is discarded needles and medical waste in public areas. That had begun to be something that we heard a lot about, and so the data shows in places where they have these centers, that level of medical waste goes down. Calls to first responders about unresponsive people lying in the bushes after they've taken a drug that they didn't understand the level of toxicity, those go down. All of the crises indicators go down with this. So again, this is a pilot, and Burlington will be the one place in the state where we're watching carefully to make sure that it performs as we believe it will. But if it's successful, if it helps us here, there are other communities that are struggling, and we would hope to get help to them as well.
I saw a statistic or report recently that said that, talking about the dramatic increase in the number of overdoses in Vermont in the last few years, and that I think 95% of those overdoses involved the use of fentanyl. Is there anything that the state can do to prevent these drugs from coming into the state in the first place? Is there anything around making sure that that the folks who are selling these drugs are facing consequences, or if there's a way to prevent them from getting here in the first place?
Well, I think that our work with tackling the backlog actually will help with this as well. I think that's one thing. I think that ensuring that we have enough officers to do the investigations is really important. I know that the number of state troopers is still below the number where we would like it, and we're always actively recruiting for more investigators. It's difficult out there, and I just want to say that I live in the Old North End, and I've had to call the police with someone who was overdosing. I've had my car broken into several times. Like, it's so real for us, right? You're seeing it. It's not something that you're seeing on the news. You're literally seeing it as you go around your neighborhood. And so I think that investments that we put into our budget around more workforce support for mental health, for more resources for providers. I know there's wait lists in some places to get access to treatment, and that's not okay. So I think some of our investments in the budget will also help with that.
And just to throw in a statistic, that I sit on the Judiciary Committee, and we had lots of testimony on this issue, and law enforcement came in and said, the little glassine bags that the drugs are usually sold in and kept in, their studies show that over the last couple of years, 100% of the bags now have fentanyl. They may not be entirely fentanyl, but there is essentially no drug in a glassine bag being sold that isn't tainted with fentanyl. And then xylazine was found in 50% of the bags. So these drugs have taken over because they're incredibly cheap, incredibly addictive, and incredibly powerful, to the point where people overdose because they continually mistake the level of toxicity in what they've bought. So, among other things, we have made it legal for people to bring whatever quantities of drugs they have in to be tested. Things like that have been helping, but I believe the OPCs, the Overdose Prevention Center, is a key to the next stage.
So we have a few minutes left here. We've talked about a lot of the work that you've done. Do you know how many bills were actually passed this session?
Oh my gosh. I do know for a fact it's over 100, but I can't.
And we only talked about like maybe 10 of them or so. Yeah. But looking ahead, so you both are leaders of the Democratic Party in Vermont, and you're on the campaign trail now for the next election. It's early, but do you have a sense of what are you hearing from voters, and what is the Democratic platform shaping up to be for the November election?
So I love going out and knocking on doors in all corners of the state. It's so helpful to get a sense of what the local challenges are and what the state challenges are and what we can do to help people. And it's still at doors, the cost of housing still comes up as a challenge. And so that is something that we're committed to continue working on. Obviously, school budgets and property taxes is another topic that I'm hearing a lot about, and having the conversation about, well, what does it look like to you? What would you want to do to make sure your kids are getting a good education, but it's affordable? Tell me what that looks like to you. So having those conversations. Public safety also, we just talked about that comes up. And then the cost of healthcare. And I think this upcoming session, we have some really hard things to tackle. Not only what's happening with public education, but also with our hospital system. And so we have several hospitals that are struggling, and that's contributing to some of the cost of healthcare in our state. And so we're going to have a tough conversation of, is this the right number of hospitals? Do we have enough primary care here or there? And it's just going to be a really hard conversation, because it's going to have an impact in communities, and we can't afford it the way that it's currently running. So that's going to be that's something that you don't hear about at doors. Like, I'm concerned about our hospital system, but I'm concerned about healthcare costs, and that's a big part of it.
Right, and I agree with all of that, and I think for most of it, if you strip it away, one of the things you're looking at as the big driver is healthcare inflation. So if you take the property tax spike and you trace it back, it was a 16% increase in healthcare costs for school districts. So that's 16% that they have very little control over. Your municipalities, the same thing. They're paying, for their employees' healthcare, and it begins to, that is the inflation in healthcare spending, begins to eat everything else. In fact, Tim Ash, who used to be the pro tem before I was, he used to call it the amoeba that ate the legislature, because we were spending more and more of our time dealing with healthcare spending and the knock-on effects for education, for municipalities, et cetera. The last thing I want to say that I hear from people going around door to door is they are worried about flooding in an existential way. They're worried about downtowns drying up. They're worried about the Vermont model, which is little towns built on the bends of beautiful rivers. Can that be sustainable as we go forward? So we need to be working, again, short, medium, and long term. I think we did fantastic work with the Flood Safety Act, but all of the renewable energy work that we've been doing, trying to move people onto cleaner heat, all of that is necessary. And as I said at an earlier point, we're kind of doing that over the objections of the governor often, and that's not helping Vermont move into the future.
That is all the time we have. Thank you both so much for joining us and talking about the work that you've done this session and what's ahead. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
you,
you.
Bobby.
Thank you for tuning in to Under the Dome. You can find this program and many more on cctv.org, and stay tuned for our coverage of the 2024 election, which is ongoing. Thanks so much.